Hi, Dr. Prilleltensky. Welcome to the Radical Therapist Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm really glad you're here, and I'm excited to talk about your work and much of your recent work, including your book written with your wife, Ora, has been around mattering and how it affects health, happiness, love, work, and society. And I thought it might be a good way to start by having you define what mattering is and what is it made up of.
Thank you for the question. So, mattering is quite simply defined as the experience of feeling valued and the opportunity to add value. So, feeling valued and adding value. And when we think about their complementary roles, they really represent a lot of the psychological needs that all human beings share. So feeling valued means being seen, being recognized, appreciated, being treated with respect and dignity, feeling like you're a worthy human being. And in our definition of mattering, we concentrate on 4 domains of life. We are saying that people should feel valued by themselves, the self, others, work, and community. And we believe these are the 4 main sources of feeling valued. And when one derives a sense of feeling valued, respected, appreciated in all these domains, the chances that we will be adding value to ourselves and others is higher. If we just go back to attachment theory, when kids feel valued, they feel safe to explore the world, to make a contribution, to take risks, to be independent, to practice autonomy. So that's pretty much how we see it. Feeling valued is almost a precondition for adding value to myself, to others, to work and community. Community writ large. It's not just our neighborhood, but also the city where I live, the country where I am a citizen of, etc. So I'll just say one more thing about the definition of mattering, which is, I just said that feeling valued is a precondition pretty much for adding value. In the best of times, we benefit from feeling valued by ourselves because we internalize positive messages from others, and we feel valued by our family, friends, etc. And then I add value to myself and others. That engenders a virtuous cycle. Because the more I add value to my friends and work and the community, the more I am reinforced. People say, oh, thank you, Isaac, for volunteering. Thank you, Isaac, for your contributions to this task force or whatever it is. And then I feel reinforced to do more of the same.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, this is in the best of times. In the worst of times, this can become a vicious cycle. If I do not feel appreciated, or every time I make a contribution, I get criticized, I encounter judgmental attitudes, I feel shame, I am humiliated, well, I think then I'm not going to feel valued, and I'm not going to feel like I can make a contribution to others, because every time I raise my hand or I do something, I get criticized, I get judged harshly by others. So that's a bit of a definition. Feeling valued, adding value, the 4 components of life: self, others, work, community, and the vicious or virtuous cycle.
Thank you. You write about this, but I'm wondering if you could share with us what are some of the effects of the lack of mattering?
Yes. So I think there are one positive effect and two very serious negative effects. I'll start with the positive effect. When people feel like they don't matter, sometimes they are motivated to take action, positive action. Maybe they are going to start a social movement like Black Lives Matter or Me Too or the civil rights movement. And there are many, many examples throughout history of people who felt marginalized and discriminated against, really organizing to regain their sense of mattering in society. So that's the positive response to lack of mattering. But there are two very negative responses. One is in the form of an internalizing problem. People become depressed, anxious, or disengaged from work. And there are also externalizing problems when people feel like they don't matter. So I'll give you a few examples. When people feel like they don't matter, they are much more likely to gravitate towards fanatic, xenophobic movements, because maybe there is a leader out there who makes them feel valued. And those leaders are very good at recruiting people who feel disenfranchised, forgotten, devalued for whatever reason. Right? So there is a lot of research, some of it conducted by my friend and colleague Ora Prilleltensky, on how terrorist groups recruit people. And some of terrorist organizations, they really have very good recruitment methods, identification of people who feel forgotten by society. And they see in them an opportunity to regain a sense of mattering by doing some extreme act, which will be very much liked by these extremist groups. So in short, there is one positive response and two negatives, internalizing or externalizing. And I just want to say, Chris, that the costs of not mattering to the individual, to the workplace, to society as a whole, the costs are grave. Mm-hmm. People become suicidal. There is research by Gregory Elliott from Brown University about teenagers who feel like they don't matter to their family. When teenagers feel like they don't matter to their family, they are much more likely to contemplate suicide, to become depressed. When an employee in the workplace feels forgotten, neglected, or even abused, by their bosses and superiors, they just become disengaged. Mm-hmm. In the US, about 70% of the workforce is disengaged. There is only about 30% of people who are really there in mind and body and spirit, fully present. Right. And the rest feel disengaged largely because they are given messages that they don't matter, that they don't feel valued, and their contributions are not appreciated. Yeah, thank you for that. And you're seeing so much of that in the extremism that we have going on, and how that's a great point about the recruitment and how the recruitment's happening, and the kind of the dark side of mattering, how people, that exactly how it's used in that way. So in your book, you write about the entitlement of me culture and how in this culture I matter is more important than we matter. And I'm wondering if you could say some more about that. Yes, absolutely. So, you may grow up in a very loving family with people who love you, parents, siblings. You may be lucky to have teachers who respect you and value you and make you feel appreciated. But above and beyond our immediate circle of care, we are influenced by a whole culture. By social media, by arts and culture and traditions and political discourse and narratives, that they are bound to have an impact on us. And when you look at the last few decades, I think there has been an ascendance of what I'm calling a me culture. It's nothing new, really. I mean, people have been talking about individualism and narcissism for a long time. But there is evidence, empirical evidence, that narcissism is on the rise in the last couple of decades. And in my attempt to understand what the me culture is, I land on the following messages. I think the me culture sends a message to people, which is as follows. I have the right to feel valued so that I may be happy. So it's all about I, about rights, about feeling valued, and about being happy. Yes, yes, we all should be happy. We all have the right to be happy. But the problem is that this neglects the other side of humanity, which is, what about the rest of us? What about people outside of your own skin? So I say that the me culture is 50% right about what we need, and the other 50% is what the we culture offers. So I define a we culture not as I have the right to feel valued so that I can be happy, but rather we all have the right and responsibility not just to feel valued, but also to add value so that we can all experience not just happiness and wellness, but also fairness. Mm-hmm. So I want everybody to be happy. I want to be happy. I want my family people to be happy. I want my neighbors to be happy. But that individual happiness must be balanced with our efforts to support other people's happiness. And other people's happiness is not going to take place unless we individually and collectively improve conditions of fairness. So we did some studies where we wanted to see the role of fairness on wellness. And not surprisingly, the more people experience fairness in their lives, all the way from the family to society, as in getting universal health care, support for housing, etc., all the way from the family to the social policy, the more people experience fairness, the higher their level of wellness. They are more satisfied with their lives. They are happier. They thrive. Mm-hmm. So that was interesting. But even more interesting, what we found was that the effect of fairness on wellness is mediated by mattering. Mm. Because when people experience fairness in their lives, they feel valued and they have opportunities to add value. And it's interesting, in empirical studies that we conducted using structural equation modeling, we found that the impact of fairness on wellness is almost completely mediated by the experience of mattering. Hmm. So in a we culture, to go back to your question, we pay attention not just to happiness, but also not just to wellness and happiness, but also to fairness and worthiness and mattering. That's the we culture we need to create, where we balance happiness with fairness.
That's wonderful. And I like how you characterize it as a responsibility too. So you did talk about fairness. I was going to ask you about fairness and fairness being important to mattering, and thank you for that. But I guess I'm going to ask you now, what are the ways we can support people experience, how we can help people experience being valued, and what are ways we might leave people feeling devalued?
There are actually many ways to do both. Some of them are seemingly benign, when you don't say hello to your coworker whom you encounter, in the hallway, when you just ignore people, when you don't answer their emails, when you don't say hello. These are seemingly banal examples of ignoring other people, but all our behaviors send messages.
Yeah.
And for some people, these messages may be interpreted, oh, there goes Isaac. He's so arrogant. He doesn't have time for me to say hello. So that is an absolute message of I devalue you as a human being. You're not worth my attention, and I don't need to answer your email. I don't need to follow up with you. I can ignore you physically, verbally, emotionally, spiritually, etc. Right? And of course, there are more grave ways, such as bullying at work or domestic violence, and all the way up to police brutality, right? So one can imagine how different systems, not just persons, but how systems make you feel devalued. So I'll give you a national example, because it's easy to think about many interpersonal examples, abuse, neglect, bullying, etc. But it also happens at the national level. I grew up in Argentina under a fascist dictatorship. When the military knocks on your door because you attended a demonstration against fascism and they disappear you, that's a way of telling you, we don't value you as a citizen. We're going to disappear you. And my sister was a political prisoner in Argentina. She was sent to exile, and I had several of my friends killed for doing just what I said, for demonstrating against fascism. Lesser ways in which governments make you feel devalued. So, for example, I lived in countries like Australia and Canada where we all had universal healthcare. So I felt valued by my government. I didn't have to prove that I have a job or that I have Aetna or United or Kaiser Permanente or whatever. The government looked after our health, and it's a signal that the government values you. In the US, the government doesn't value you very much. We have millions, tens of millions of people with either no healthcare or inadequate healthcare, right? So if you can think about that, as a citizen, I feel like I don't matter here, So there are many ways to make you feel like devalued. Okay, how do we make you feel valued? Okay, that's the other part of your question. I think it starts because we're all embodied psychological beings. We have to pay attention to our experience of humanity. And it starts, as I said, by saying hello to people, by treating them with dignity, by building on their strengths, by building on their assets, by making them feel that they can make a contribution to the workplace, to the community, not focusing on their deficits or weaknesses, but focusing on their dignity and what is it that they can contribute. Not as what people don't have, but what do people do have? And the more we focus on their strengths, the more we make people feel your presence is important to me. And it starts at the interpersonal level. And I'll just give you a quick example because it's stuck in my mind for many years. When I became Dean of the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Miami, I used to make a point of stopping by the receptionist and saying hello. And she was this super smart, vivacious, terrific woman. And the first time that I did that and I stopped by her counter, she started crying. And I said, what's going on? And she said, the previous dean was here for 10 years and he didn't even know my name. Okay? So that just gives you an example of it matters to treat people with dignity. It really matters. Now, in the workplace, one way to make you feel valued is to give you opportunities for leadership. And maybe if you're a leader, and I was a dean, I was a vice provost, it was my job to identify people's strengths and give them an opportunity to grow in their jobs. And it doesn't mean always we need to give people a formal promotion, but sometimes just asking for their opinion, like you go to them and say, like, I respect your opinion. I'm having this problem. What do you think? It can be as simple as that. It can be as elaborate as mentoring somebody to become the next dean or vice provost or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. But it also matters at the systemic and policy level, how we make people feel valued. I'll just give you an example from community psychology. There is a very successful program. It's called Housing First, to help people in homelessness situations. Mm-hmm. And my dear colleague, Jeff Nelson, he was one of the big promoters of this program in Canada and internationally. And I know a lot about it because of my friend Jeff. And Housing First says to people who are homeless, we're not going to put a lot of conditions for you to get a house. First, we're going to help you get housing. And then if you have an addiction or a mental health problem, we're going to work on that too, obviously. But there are many programs to house people who are homeless that first impose so many conditions: get clean, right, go to this treatment, that treatment. It doesn't work. No. So it's an example of giving people dignity by looking after their basic needs first, right? So I'm just going to say one more thing about this, how to make people feel valued, Chris. And I think it's important to consider both objective resources and subjective resources. So subjective resources are, for example, offering emotional support to someone. Your colleague is going through a hard time. Well, maybe you offer to listen, or just being a good friend, being there for them. Maybe your friend got a promotion and you show interest and you're excited for them. So these are subjective, emotional, psychological ways of supporting somebody, making them feel valued. But there are also objective ways to make people feel valued. As I was saying before, give them housing, give them universal health care, mm-hmm, give them objective things they need, give them a good schooling for their kids, give them early childhood education for free. There are so many objective resources that we have the obligation to give people and not put conditions before they can get the objective resource, right? So in this country, unless you have a decent job, you don't have a good healthcare, mm-hmm, right? So it's like, first have a decent job, and then we'll see if we can give you this, that, or the other. So I just think it's very important to always remember, especially for the radical therapist audience, that we keep in mind the subjective and the objective resources people need.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you for that. My next question is about positivity, and positivity these days is often critiqued as potentially being toxic for various reasons. But you write that adding value coupled with positivity is important, and I'm wondering if you could say more about that.
Mm-hmm. If I go back to the example I gave about building on people's positive attributes and strengths, and I'll just start by giving you a very personal example. Mm. When I was 8 years old, I lost both of my parents in a car accident. Mm. And you can imagine, very traumatic.
Right.
And I remember as a kid, my teachers, my relatives, focusing on Isaac the orphan and pitying me. And I felt a great sense of pity projected onto me. Hmm. And part of me wanted to tell them, look, I'm still here. I'm still a good friend. I'm still a very good soccer player. I'm still doing a lot of good things. And could anybody please focus on that too? You know, I'll give you another personal example. My wife of 40 years, Ora, uses a wheelchair. She has muscular dystrophy. She's been using a wheelchair for many, many years. So people often focus on the disability as opposed to the person. My wife is a very smart person. She was a professor for many years, and she's an incredibly mature, wise, competent, caring person. So we have had so many encounters where people looked at the disability before they looked at the person. So Ora has incredible talents and resources. And I had too as a kid, you know, and can we please focus on your positive attributes? Okay. Now, about the critique of positivity, when positivity becomes a pillar for a me culture, that's a serious problem, right? So we talked earlier about the me culture. And there are many positivity trends today that feed into that. That feed into what's important is that I take time out because the world is hard, so I need to take care of number one first, and blah, 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 blah. I do not believe that positivity must always go along just with individualism. We can have positivity of the collective. How can we appreciate people who grow up in poverty, for example? How can we really celebrate their ingenuity of coping with very difficult circumstances, but yet being smart, managing, coping, handling very tough situations? So I don't want positivity to be kidnapped just by the me cultures, but I also want to make sure that we acknowledge strengths of everybody, including people who struggle.
Wonderful. Okay. In your book, you also go beyond just the personal and psychological aspects of mattering and address its societal and political aspects. And I'm wondering if you can say more about that.
Right. So it's very interesting if we go back to the examples I gave about the people who feel marginalized, gravitating towards populist leaders, for example, which is an example we see around the world, right? We saw this. We see this today in Turkey. You know, they just had elections, and it looks like Erdogan is going. He still may win the runoff of the election, and we have Viktor Orban in Hungary, and we had our very own Trump. We still have him around here, and if you look at so many countries around the world, the Philippines, El Salvador, there are so many populists who are really exploiting people's lack of mattering for their own political advantage.
Right.
And that's a very risky situation. So this is really at the nexus of the psychological and the political. And it's so important to provide people with a sense of mattering so that we can prevent gravitating towards extremist points of view that tend to go along with denigration of other groups and xenophobia, etc., etc. And because there are so many lost souls in a me culture, there is so much loneliness. There are so many people who feel completely isolated and abandoned. There are many people who will buy the populist message. And that is extremely risky. Right. So I think there is room for mattering education, for psychosocial interventions that really pair the psycho with the social, psychological health with social health, with cultural health, with political health. So I do some work. I'm affiliated with a Norwegian university. I'm part of a research center on welfare and sustainability. And we're doing some work on well-being economies. And we're looking at what are some countries doing to prioritize psychological health and mattering. If you really dissect what early childhood intervention programs, child abuse prevention programs, parenting support, a lot of the social interventions, social programs that countries build, they are about helping children feel that they matter and giving them an opportunity to matter by improving their education, upgrading their skills. So I believe that well-being economies are trying to focus on how to make everybody feel that they matter. There is a lot of work to be done, and there are two possible problems with advanced economies. One is that on one hand, you may provide a lot of resources to people. Let's say Norway, or the Scandinavian countries. They provide a lot of resources to people. I mean, really, it's a luxury, to be a citizen of these countries in a way. But it's not enough. It's not enough to give you free healthcare and free education. You also need to be treated with respect and kindness by social services, by teachers, by doctors, etc. So I go back to the importance of objective and subjective resources. And on the other hand, we always need to give subjective with objective resources. It's not enough to, you can do therapy until the cows come home. But if people are poor and hungry, we're not going to make much progress. And so I just want to put a plug, not for my book, How People Matter, which is the book you're reading from, but I want to put a plug for a recent book by Matthew Desmond called Poverty by America.
I just read it. Yeah.
Yeah. Isn't it an incredible book?
Yeah, highly recommend. Yeah, just read it. Yep.
Yeah. So it really gives you a sense of the dignity challenges that people growing up in poverty go through, or just another recent example, the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, another incredible book about growing up Black in America or lower caste in India.
Right.
Anyways, there are, what I like about these authors is that not only do they describe the sociological and economic and political conditions affecting people, but also the dignity wounds that all these policies inflict on people. And so that's, for me, fairness, wellness, and worthiness is this very important triangle: fairness, wellness, and worthiness that attend to the subjective and the objective needs of human beings.
Wonderful. Okay. You also write about the practicing self-regard, and I'm wondering, how do we practice self-regard?
Yeah. Well, it's part of being responsible to oneself. And if you look at really, I would say, the best of positive psychology or the best of therapeutic interventions, mindfulness, self-compassion, there are very many good skills and techniques that all of us should embrace to make sure that we are psychologically and physically and socially healthy. And we can think about self-compassion and treating ourselves with the same kindness that we want to treat our friends or family members with, or our neighbors, right? So I really believe that self-compassion and mindfulness are really, really important. And there are many serious thinkers and writers who do not believe that self-compassion should lead to a me culture, but rather to a we culture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, it's the analogy when you board the plane and they say, please put your oxygen mask first before you help your child or your spouse. It's a very good analogy, because if you have no psychological energy or physical energy to help yourself, you're going to be no good for other people either, right? You can't help others if you're not psychologically, physically healthy. So I'm a big proponent of treating yourself kindly and developing the discipline required to build psychological health, to ask for help when you need it, to be vulnerable when you can, and to celebrate others and start this virtuous cycle. You love me, I want to show that I love you too. So we have this mutual responsibility so that you can be there with me when I need you. I think psychologists know a great deal about our psycho-emotional needs, and we need to pay attention to those. We don't need to stop there. We need to go beyond that so that we can go towards a we culture, and we can affect also policies and not just emotions, but they're both important.
Yeah, and that leads me to my next question. You write about abundant or cohesive communities, and I'm wondering, what role does mattering play in like those kinds of communities, and also just relationships in general?
Well, mattering is the glue of a cohesive community. And what's interesting about that is that successful communities, maybe faith communities or neighborhoods or organizations, can also be communities. What they do, they structure time and space and rituals and traditions to make sure that everyone feels valued and have an opportunity to add value. So they have very elaborate, successful communities have very elaborate ways of giving you an important role. So in successful communities, everyone has a role, an important job. Maybe you are in charge of the social committee or the organizing committee or X or Y task force. But successful communities make sure that everyone has an opportunity to feel like I'm adding value here. And there are, as I said, very elaborate rituals, ways of make you feel included, and you cannot build a community without FaceTime. So this is why meals are important, and rituals, and this is why people go to church and mosques and temples, and they spend time with others, and they celebrate, and because that FaceTime, especially during celebrations, it builds community. And if you've ever been part of a community of friends, you know what it feels like when you're going through a hard time and other people just are there for you. It brings me to tears sometimes. Like sometimes at home we go through difficult situations. My wife's health is very precarious right now. But I have friends who have shown so much love to me and my wife and family members. So they show up for you. right? So they make me feel valued. They said, no, you know, I want to be there for you. But in turn, they ask me for help when I can help them. So it's really very simple, Chris. You know, like what we should be asking ourselves is, how can I make Chris feel valued? And how can I make Chris feel like he's adding value? These are really, it's two very simple questions. So there is a lot of complicated psychology around it, you know, in-group bias, the dark side of mattering, attachment. There are many complicated dynamics behind it. But at the end of the day, what human beings want is to feel valued and add value. So it's really important that leaders, bosses, workplaces, each one of us think about that. What can I do to add value to myself and feel valued and do the same for others?
Wonderful. Yeah. Okay, two more questions. And you kind of touched on this a little bit about kind of in being face to face. And we're in the midst of a technological revolution. Artificial intelligence is here. And I guess I wanted to ask you about, what do you imagine, how, or even social media too, how is that affecting mattering or meaning making in your mind?
Well, it's interesting that the Surgeon General last couple of days just put out a big report on the impact of social media on teens and youth, and predictably the news are not good. And there is definitely research on that the more you use social media, the more depressed you become. Of course, there are healthy ways of using social media if you use it for short periods of time and you use it for beneficial purposes like seeking information, etc. So needless to say, there are many good uses of social media, but teens easily become addicted to social media. And the key psychological negative mechanism is the comparison effect. Because people are always in social media, you know, comparing themselves to more successful, more competent, more beautiful, more popular, wealthier, richer, muscular, sexier people than they are. And it's a no-win situation, right? So the effect on that is that you are hyper exposed to these unattainable images of what the me culture wants you to become, you know, consume. I live in Miami, you know, plastic surgery is the #1 industry here. You know, people want to look better, feel sexier, have more money, bigger cars, more jewelry, whatever. And it's a never-ending game, right? So this consumerism, you're consuming images in social media. You're always comparing yourself, and you're always losing because there is always somebody who has it better than you, right? So that leads to negative internalization. I'm not as good as the rest of the world. So the psychological principles are not really that complicated. You are exposed to a lot of toxicity in social media. And it's really become so addictive because the media platforms are very good at getting you addicted. So you get this dopamine hit, you know, every time you click or you see how many people like you, whatever that is. So I believe the effects are very toxic, to tell you the truth. Of course, there are good usages, and there was research done during COVID-19, you know, when people couldn't see others face to face, they use WhatsApp and Zoom, and all that's fantastic. I love that. But there is the dark side of technology, which I would just summarize by saying downward comparisons that people are ill-equipped to handle. So that's my take on the hyper exposure to social media.
Thank you for that. Okay, last question. This is a question I like to ask all my guests, and it's really about, what books or films or ideas or thinkers are capturing your attention these days. What are you curious about these days?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. So, as I said before, the book Cast by Isabel Wilkerson made a big impression on me, the way she deals with racism and classism. And I also mentioned just the book Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond.
Mm-hmm.
And I am highly impacted by a Harvard philosopher, a communitarian by the name of Michael Sandel. And a very important book that he wrote recently, it's about meritocracy. It's about the ill effects of meritocracy and what it does to people.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about meritocracy, it's the anti-mattering.
Okay. Yeah.
Because unless you are smart or successful or self-made in this country, you are worthless.
Right.
So there are many. So Michael Sandel has done tremendous work demonstrating the culture of meritocracy and its toxic negative effects on people. So these are interesting books I read recently, and also along the lines of being self-made and wrong solutions to our social ills. I want to recommend work by Anand Giridharadas. And, oh gosh, the name of his book is, it has the word winners in it. Let me just...
I have the book. I haven't read it yet. I'm trying to remember the title too.
Yes, Winners Take All.
There it is, yep.
Yeah, the elite charade of changing the world.
Right.
And he really takes aim at a lot of the saviors in our society who have this savior complex, who are going to come and fix all the social ills, maybe with entrepreneurship or the latest startup or some technology.
Right.
And Giridharadas does a fantastic job of debunking all of that.
Yeah.
So these are some of the things that occupy me these days, and they all have to do with the intersection of wellness, fairness, and worthiness. Yeah. So for me, that's the really important triangle that occupies me these days. Yeah. What conditions of fairness can lead to real solutions for wellness? And it all happens through mattering. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's an excellent place to stop. And I just want to say thank you for making the time and sharing with all our listeners. And listeners all have the links to actually their book, but also some of the books that were mentioned too. I'll have that links. And I just want to one more time, I just want to say, Dr. Prilleltensky, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Chris. I enjoyed chatting with you.
Wonderful.